Now we're going to talk about standard deductions and itemized deductions. These are some of the most talked about areas of the tax law, because this is where everybody thinks they can deduct everything under the sun, and that's just not true. So let's look at the first one here. Let's talk about standard deductions. Standard deductions are just amounts given to us by the government, and it's based on your filing status. And so you figure out your filing status, you look it up on the chart, and it tells you this much, and you get to deduct that much. Itemized deductions are a little more confusing, because you have to be able to support them, that you spent that money on those items, and there are certain categories. Okay, so standard deduction versus itemized deduction. You get either one. You do not get to do both. A lot of people get that confused. They think they can take their standard deduction and then some medical expenses too. You don't do that. You either take the standard deduction or the itemized deduction. And itemizing is much better, because you only take it if it's larger than your standard deduction. So you add up all of your itemized deductions, and if it is a bigger number than your standard deduction, then that's the one we're going to use. And since you subtract that from your AGI, the more itemized deductions you have, the lower your taxable income is going to be, which will result in lower taxes to you. So we want to use an itemized deduction if we can. But truth be told, with the TCJA from 2018, when they doubled the standard deduction, a lot of people have done away with being able to itemize, because the standard deduction is now larger than all of their itemized deductions. Some people are required to use the itemized deduction, regardless if it's bigger or smaller than the standard deduction, and that's married filing separately people. If one person itemizes, they both have to itemize. And so that is exception. There are some very weird cases where it might be preferential to itemize to minimize other taxes, such as the AMT. This is alternative minimum tax. And in some cases, itemized deductions are phased out due to the AMT. And so you might want to use the standard deduction, even though it's smaller than your itemized deduction. So the standard deduction, like I said, it's given to us by the IRS. It goes up every year. This is one of those minor tax law changes we talked about in about the first video, where I said they adjust for a cost of living increase every year. It's the easiest one there is, because all you got to do is know your filing status, and boom, you know your standard deduction. It's audit proof because it's given to us by the IRS. So they don't have to prove anything other than your filing status. So if you're really single, but you file a married filing joint and claim the married standard deduction, that's not going to work. So all you got to be able to do is support your filing status, which is really easy to do. And so you don't have to worry about keeping up receipts or anything. Now, these are last year's numbers, so they're a little higher for 2020, 2019. I believe these are 2018 numbers. So I think they've gone up a few $100s. I believe married filing jointly is now $24,400. Which means the single is probably $12,200. But this gives you an idea of what we're looking at. So you have your filing status over here. You got 5 filing statuses, which we'll talk in great detail in the next chapter. And then here's the standard deduction you get for it. And don't worry if you don't know what these mean right now. We're going to talk about those in the next one. So itemized deductions. This is the big one. This is the one where people always think they get to claim everything. And like we talked about in a previous video, we claim these on the Schedule A of the tax return. Schedule A is just for your itemized deductions. And this is stuff that's calculated by the taxpayer or your tax preparer, and it's only based on the actual dollar amount that you spent for those various deductions. This one's the hardest to use, because you got to know, first you got to know, is this an itemized deduction? And then you got to be able to support it. You got to show that you paid it in the current year. And you got to have some backup documentation to go with it. And depending on how much it is, you could become a big audit target. Now, the IRS doesn't typically audit you just because you itemize. That's one of the falsities you'll hear a lot of times. Oh, if you itemize, you're going to get audited. No, that's not true. But they do know the IRS collects 135 million tax returns every year. It has a huge database of data. They know the average charitable amount for, a single person who's a school teacher is this much money. So if you're a single person who's a school teacher, but you gave way, way more than that amount, yeah, they might look at you a little bit more. But as long as you're within that, one standard deviation, probably, they're not going to care that you've itemized. Some of the most common ones are medical expenses, and we're going to talk about that because there is a limitation on medical. Charitable contributions, property taxes, state income taxes, mortgage interest. These are the big ones. These are the ones that you see on just about everybody. I always call the charity, property tax, and mortgage interest the big three for itemizing. Of course, we're in Texas, so we don't have a state income tax, but in other high income tax states, your state income tax should probably be a really big one. And then, like I mentioned before, with the 2018 tax law changes, a lot of people no longer itemize. When you were having your standard deduction for a married couple at $12,000, it was very easy to get over that with your property taxes and mortgage interest. Here in Texas, a decent house can have property taxes of $5,000 to $6,000 a year, and mortgage interest is not uncommon to be $6,000 to $10,000 a year. So with just these two alone, people were often able to itemize. And charitable contributions, most people are doing $2,000, $3,000 or so or more. And so with these three items, it's very easy to get over that $12,000 mark. But with now that it's at $24,000 for a married filing jointly couple, it's much harder to get over those numbers. So here again, we've looked at the Schedule A before. Here's what it looks like. You have the medical first, the taxes that you've paid, the interest that you've paid, charitable contributions, and some casualties. This is where, due to fire, tornadoes, etc. And then various other deductions. The biggest one we see down here is gambling losses, especially when we're this close to a casino. Gambling losses appear quite frequently. And again, we're going to talk more about all of these in another chapter. Okay, so that is a brief overview of what standard and itemized deductions are. We're going to go over all of them in greater depth, how to figure out what your filing status is, and more detail about the itemized deductions in a future video.